Today I am joined by best-selling and award-winning historian Samuel Marquis. Samuel has written widely on colonial America, the golden age of piracy, as well as World War II. And he's also the ninth great grandson of the legendary captain William Kidd. His newest book, called Empire and Frontier, takes us into a largely forgotten but pivotal chapter of early American history, King William's War, and the fragile alliance between Colonel Peter Schuyler and the Five Nations of the Iroquois. It is a story of diplomacy, survival, and cross cultural partnership on the violent frontier, one that helped shape the balance of power in North America for generations. I hope you guys enjoyed today's conversation. Sam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Peter.
So we're just going to continue our conversation as we've been talking for a while now. You've written about pirates, World War II, and early, American frontier. What made you shift to the early American frontier, and how did that bring you to this particular story?
Well, I think I wrote 5 World War II books because I had a World War II series that sort of each book sort of stands alone and is a different theater in Europe. So I covered like the spy, Eddie Chapman, the British spy. I covered the desert warfare and Lions of the Desert. And at some point, I kind of just got a little bit burnt out on the Nazis and in Germany because they were all sort of in the European theater, different stories. In Rome, I did one sort of the Roman. So I kind of sort of covered each theater too. So then I just pivoted to Captain Kidd. I had written a book on Blackbeard. So I wrote, my first book wasn't about my ninth great grandfather, Captain Kidd. It was actually about Blackbeard. Just because I was in the Outer Banks and needed a book one rainy day. And I got a book on Blackbeard and I was like, oh my God, this is really, so and I grew up with pirate stories because Captain Kidd's my ninth great grandfather, which means just 9 generations. And so then at some point, having written Blackbeard, I was like, well, I'll do a book on Captain Kidd, my ninth great grandfather. And I wanted to do a biography as comprehensive as I could. So the first cut was 1,050 pages, with endnote, 300 pages of endnotes, bibliography, because I wanted to write the definitive book on my ninth great grandfather. So of course that got cut back quite a bit, for before I even got it to my agent. But, then now it's more of a streamlined, covers his, Captain Kidd's history from 1689 to 1701. Then once I wrote that book, there was, on the periphery of that was all these Iroquois wars going on during King William's War from 1689 to 1701 in upstate New York and in Canada. So I had all the research kind of already done for Captain Kidd. So I just pivoted to the Indian frontier, the Iroquois, the Five Nations, and Peter Schuyler.
There's so many things to unpack here. A few things. One, awesome about your background, right? That's the first thing that kind of came up, if one Googles you. Does that kind of change how you approach writing, knowing that like there is like historical blood flowing through you? Does it give you any form of like, I need to like step up to the plate kind of thing?
Well, I think in the case of Captain Kidd, people always say, oh, you're trying to vindicate your ninth great grandfather and sort of exonerate, this villainous cutthroat Captain Kidd, who, as I like to say, the most famous pirate of all time wasn't even a pirate, because he was railroaded by the crown. And, I know you've probably read, Empire and Frontier, but not Captain Kidd, that came before it, but they are good companion books, as I say in the back of Empire and Frontier. So when I wanted to step up and play, yes, I wanted to be accurate. That's why the first cut was literally 1,050 pages long, because I covered every little event and I debated it. What was he doing here? What was he thinking? Is he good, bad? What is he? Was he really a pirate? I mean, Captain Kidd was the trusty and well-beloved William Kidd of King William III of England. George Washington in the French and Indian War, the Fourth French and Indian War, which was called the 7 Years' War from 1754 to 1763, right before the American Revolution, wanted more than anything to be an officer in the English army. He was always denied. Yet Captain Kidd, my great grandfather, was the trusty and well-beloved Captain Kidd of the King of England, which is always ironic. I love to say that just because, you can't always often say, well, George Washington didn't get that honor, but Captain Kidd did.
That's awesome. Yeah, the other thing is, like you mentioned, like 1,000 pages. Isn't it so sad when you have to cut your own work? Like I've done that where I've written something and they're like, "That's great, cut out 10,000." I'm like, 10,000 words,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because you know how long it took for you to write those 10,000 words.
I kind of knew, Captain Kidd I knew because I had to get it published and published in a good format with a company that was, good, which was Diversion Books, and then Simon and Schuster, they kind of worked together for, the publishing and distribution. So I knew I'd have to cut quite a bit of it, but I wanted to get it right on paper. I wanted sort of the director's cut, the author's cut, like movies, of everything, so that I really knew this guy.
Yeah.
Because I grew
So
up with goofy stories of Captain Kidd that were swashbuckling, almost like "Where's the rum?" every minute, and the cutlasses and walking the plank, and none of it was true. I discovered that really he was a New York hero. He was one of the wealthiest guys in New York City, and he was the trusted, well-beloved, Captain Kidd of the King of England as a privateer, a legally licensed, commerce raider or naval commander. So it's interesting, and he's in our new book that we're discussing, Empire and Frontier, but he has a much smaller role in that.
yeah. So getting to this newest book, it really is a story about an alliance, the Schuyler alliance with the Iroquois. Do you think this alliance was friendship, strategic, or something more complicated?
Well, originally the Covenant chain came out in the, like the six in the 16 by the 1680s it was established. So what it was an alliance between basically the province of New York, Massachusetts Bay is what it was called then, Virginia and Maryland, with the five nations of the Iroquois. So, the Mohawks, the Seneca, the Onondaga, Cayuga, and the Tuscarora came later, and the Oneida. So those are the there were only five nations then. Now they're the six nations. But the alliance was kind of between, these colonial American, provinces. But Peter Schuyler became sort of the lead commissioner of Indian Affairs, negotiated with all of the Iroquois and the Mohicans and all the tribes that had been sort of assimilated into the Iroquois. So he, in essence, become the key figure of the Covenant chain by the late 1680s and all the way into like all the way out into like 1720. So he was an important figure for almost 40 years, negotiating with the Native Americans. He's a colonial American of Dutch background. He grew up running around with Mohawks and Mohicans all around, the Albany area. So he grew up hunting, tracking, speaking Mohawk language. So he spoke Dutch, English, and Mohawk. He wasn't as fluent to be a full-fledged translator like Hilletie van Olinda, who's in my book, who's a biracial Mohawk Dutch woman who was a paid interpreter, but he spoke conversantly in Mohawk language. And so he was a frontiersman straight out of like Hawkeye out of The Last of the Mohicans. I mean, he really was that kind of guy. So he wore a lot of hats. He was the mayor, the head of the militia. So he was, Major Schuyler, and then he became Colonel Schuyler. And he was also the head Indian commissioner, was a key role. He was also assistant governor and acting governor later. He wore so many hats back then.
The story obviously revolves around him, but you supplemented with a lot of interesting, I want to call them secondary characters. How did you go about choosing the characters through which you're going to tell this story?
Well, the three, I always, for my books, I like multiple point of view characters. And I like to have men, women, different ages, different backgrounds, different socioeconomic standing. And so but you got to be able to fit the history exactly, because I'm a historian first and foremost. This book has, I think, 80 pages of endnotes and bibliography. And so it's first and foremost a scholarly work, but it's told in a fast-paced narrative nonfiction style. So there are 3 points of view. Colonel Peter Schuyler, who's kind of, probably the lead character, just because I had the most information on him. If I had had more information on the Native American characters, I would have emphasized them equally. They're close to equal to him, but not quite, just because I don't have as much on them. So the other one is Lawrence the Mohawk. We don't know his Native American name, but he was a Mohawk war captain and a diplomat and peace negotiator. And he's awesome. So there's a statue of him in downtown Schenectady that's in my book that I took a picture of. So a lot of the pictures in my book I took myself of the Mohawk River Valley, because it's like you're there, Last of the Mohicans. It's awesome. And so Lawrence was a really important figure and fighting the French. So this is all King William's War from 1689 to 1701, including, the final peace treaty of the Iroquois, which happened in 1701. One was signed in Montreal, the other was in New York. So all of those take place with battles between New France, which is French Canada, and really New York, which is, English America fighting. And they're going back and forth up to the Lake Champlain and the St. Lawrence River Valley, and all the fighting is going basically between Albany and Montreal, back and forth in the Mohawk River Valley. So the third point of view character is a woman, a biracial Mohawk Dutch woman named Hilletie van Olinda. And so she was raised her first 19 years in a Mohawk village in Ticonderoga, which is in the Mohawk River Valley. And so she's fluent in Mohawk, but she later went to Schenectady and lived as a European and married a Dutchman. So, and her father was Dutch. So her father was Dutch, kind of a fur trapper, carpenter, doing all kinds of stuff. And so she was a paid interpreter of the English crown and New York, earning a salary of, almost $10,000 a year, which was a lot for, like part-time job. So those are the 3 point of view characters in the book.
So let's kind of back away for a second and look at King William's War itself. I mean, I guess obviously it's overshadowed, right, by a bigger one that comes later. But why do you think it is, I guess, wrong to downplay this war? What's the importance of this conflict?
I think the problem is, let's start with how we're taught American history, how, my generation was taught. Probably it was different than your generation, and it's different than it's being taught now. But there's still always been, now they recognize more, indigenous voices and African-American voices and all the people that contributed to America, which is the way it should be. That's why my book is the way it is, because I want all the voices. When I grew up, it literally was Jamestown and the Pilgrims of Plymouth, and then skips to the Revolution, skips completely. You're talking about 150 years of history just wiped out. Like, that's not important. I mean, come on. And so it's kind of, Plymouth Rock, they got, the Algonquin tribes got the Native American, got the, the colonizers, through the winter, and okay, let's go to the Revolution now. It's like, no, it's incredibly interesting. It's even almost more interesting because it is a frontier. The easy, just, 25 miles inland is a vast, wild frontier that's contested between the French. You have the Spanish down, in Florida and Louisiana and all of those areas. You have the English and the Dutch. The Dutch are in New York. People forget that the Dutch, multi-ethnic New York is because it was Dutch, So all these jostling empires. And then, of course, the Native Americans, whether they're Iroquois or Algonquin tribes, are caught in the middle of all this. So it's incredibly interesting. Contested frontier. Now, it's obviously ended up being tragic for Native Americans. But the story of the Dutch and the Iroquois is a much more positive story. That's another thing that attracted me to it. There was a synergy. Peter Schuyler had, Mohawk and Mohican who were camping out on his property, living with him for months on end, eating at his dinner table, fighting alongside him in a synergistic way. I mean, there were still imperialists, you can't, let's be honest about it. But remember, both sides are trying to gain something from the other. but there was much more synergy and collaboration between the Dutch. And I think a lot of it's because the Dutch valued trade partnerships. So there are a lot of positive aspects of the Iroquois and the Dutch in New York, before King's William's War and during it. And I think the real tragedy is a lot of the tragedy is the diseases that were brought aboard. The disease killed a lot more than wars. Warfare. We have to remember that it's like almost like talking about shark attacks versus driving fatalities. People are worried about shark attacks, but really it's the driving fatalities are driving it. Disease was just what really was just so deadly for these poor Indian tribes especially on the East Coast and inland, even upstate New York. Particularly
So
smallpox, obviously.
yeah, I often ask this question: if you were to turn this into a trailer for your book, right, and you wanted to take a reader and just kind of drop them in the middle of an action, any action in your book, any scene in your book, which you think would kind of like get them, whoa, like into what's coming. I want to read the rest of it. Can you think of one scene that you might want to, just drop this reader into?
Well, I think for me, it would be the battles of La Prairie. That chapter. I mean, that it was one of the most, intense and violent battles of the four French and Indian Wars. And Count Frontenac, the French governor of New France, which was French Canada back then, was like, this was, that was an amazing battle. Now, you have to remember, for some people, this is hatchet to hatchet, tomahawk to tomahawk, bayonet and musket, point blank range. This is intense warfare. So it's, that seems pretty graphic in my book, but it's honest, and I discuss the casualties and the charges. So basically the Mohawks, led by Lawrence, who was an amazingly brave war captain, charged 3 times. The New York colonial, Peter Schuyler and his militia and his Mohawk and Mohican forces were outnumbered 3-1 when they attacked French Canada. So they attacked outside Montreal, but one army defeated them, and then they were heading back to their canoes, and they were cut off by another army. So the battles of La Prairie are 2 battles, one near Montreal, one near what was called Fort Chambly back at the time. Which would be on the Richer River, that feeds the Lake Champlain. So as they're going back, they were caught by another army, and they had to fight their way through them because they blockaded. They had the position. They had built like fortifications of trees and felled trees. So to me, that's just an outrageously intense battle. So for me, that would probably.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's so many other ones, but that's cool. And it's, I'm sure, because as a writer myself, so whenever I read books, I almost saw you sitting at your computer, like every few minutes, just like closing your eyes real quick and like imagining it because it felt very vivid, so as you're writing it. So I assume that obviously that comes across, but I assume that kind of what happens. Does that happen to you when you're writing these scenes? You're kind of just like, you get caught up in it and you're just in it and you're trying to describe what you're seeing on the left, on the right, and where it's going?
I do. And I think the reason that was so vivid is the French battlefield reports are very detailed. So I had all that, and Schuyler had a journal. So he wrote a journal. I quote him. You can see there were a lot of quotes from him at that battle. So I had multiple perspectives. You always want more of the Native American perspective because, that's not recorded, but at least they were recorded in the meetings. A lot of the council meetings recorded those. So they're meeting every year and then multiple times a year in Albany with Colonel Peter Schuyler and Hilletie van Olinda taking all the notes, interpreting everything every year. And there you're getting the Native American perspective on everything. And again, it's translated by a biracial Mohawk Dutch woman, but still you get at least some, you get their perspective. We always need more Native American perspective though,
Yeah.
from,
Yeah,
oral
it's
history
interesting.
can only go so far, but it is
Yeah.
helpful, so.
Yeah, but it's hard to find stuff. It is definitely hard to because you can't invent things in history, right? So we could only go based on what is available, and and kind of at the whatever I find when I don't have a lot of source of something, I try to build up the context around it. It's like if I only have single source for something, then I look at I make that the center and I try to build around it with the context of what we know because we can't make stuff up. So it's like, all right, well, how does the context play or interplay with what we know about this person? And you kind of touched upon this before, by taking the images for your book, but um, it sounds like you were definitely a history fan when writing this. You weren't just the author. You were like, I'm totally geeking out. I'm loving all of this. I want to know more. Where did this research take you?
Well, the funny thing is that I'm sort of an unusual author in that I'm a professional scientist. I have a master's degree in geology. I'm a hydrogeologist, which is a groundwater geologist and expert witness in class action cases inviting contamination, groundwater plumes of contamination. I use computer models to figure out how they got there, how to clean it up, who's going to pay, and I testify. On different sides depending on the case. So I'm a professional groundwater scientist cleaning up the environment. So I do, I'm a good guy on that, but there's this history nerd that you're tapping into here that just loves history. I always loved history. I was kind of a big, the weird thing is I'm also like a jock, lacrosse player or hockey player. I'm inducted into my high school Hall of Fame, if you can believe that, for pretty much
Nice.
hockey, lacrosse, and soccer. So I'm sort of this, whatever, sporty nerd, scientist, historian, kind of a weirdo to be honest, who loves all this stuff. So I just don't do anything halfway. If I go, I'm all in. So I just love history, just like you. It's and always like you said, discovering things that are new too.
Yeah. So, like, did this take you far? I mean, I did notice that internet and digitization of all these files make it much easier to do research, but you still have to kind of get out, right? Do you take your family on these trips, or do you just like, I'll be back in 2 days, guys? How does
No,
this
I
work for
think
you?
I did this. I worked this around. I gave a talk out in New York on Captain Kidd, and so they kind of flew me out there to do a talk out at this this event. And there were like 50 or 60 people there for that, and so I just kind of went and got to see the Mohawk River Valley, Albany, and all of these places for this book. I think, yeah, I don't want to drag my wife around everywhere. She wants to go to like, you
The
know,
beach.
yeah, she wants to go to the Caribbean or Hawaii or,
Yeah,
so
I'm with you on that one.
these are
Yeah.
these are places that I just go. But yes, the research is fun. I think most of it, you just have to be honest with the documents, get as many as you can. I read everything I can, every book, anything that's ever scrap written, and then I try and decide who are kind of I always find my core 10 historians. And I give them credit. In my book, I gave those 10 people credit and kind of find out who's really are the experts on this. Then I kind of like, okay, and then once I build up a trust with them, I have all the primary sources, and then I look at how everyone's interpreted because I look at both. I like to see other people's perspective, because I'm not a pure historian. I'm a narrative nonfiction historian. So I write in a, fast-paced narrative that makes it accessible to a lot of people, but it's history. It is 85 pages of endnotes and bibliography. So
Yeah.
we're not fooling around.
Yeah, I speak to academic historians, and a lot of them are like, look, they rather write the book for the masses, a history book for the masses, than write. I've heard one of the historians said, I don't want to write a book just so that five academics read it. I want to write a book so people learn from history and it's more accessible to everybody else. It's a different type of writing.
Be honest, I like to, if you notice the blurbs on the, my book cover, it's sort of half academic scholars and sort of half authors. So I like to get them. I want the scholarship comes first, but you got to tell a really fast paced, exciting story.
Yeah, yeah,
So I
absolutely.
I like a book that appeals to everyone, to be
Yeah.
honest with you.
When you write your books, who do you write for? Like, do you think to yourself, like, I'm writing to like tell myself a good story for my family? For like, do you have like someone in mind or a group of people in mind when you write these stories? Like a
To
mindset?
be honest, I write really I don't want to say I write for myself because it sounds, selfish. It's not
Yeah.
that. I want to get the history right and tell a good story. That's really the two foremost things. Is it has to be accurate, and then it has to be exciting, and also take us someplace. Here, this is about, to me, what's important about this book is, first of all, King William's War is overlooked, and it was played an important role in all the subsequent French and Indian Wars and the Revolution. Why? Because all of the places that they're fighting were the same places that they all fought for all those wars. So all of the approaches, all of the supply trains, excuse me, all of the attacks on Quebec, all of those were reenacted over and over and over again for the next 100 years. Even the War of 1812, really, we're going 120 years. So everything that happened at King William's War, that it was the first war. It's almost like World War I. There are a lot of those battlefields at World War II. They were going over the Argonne and all the same places when they invaded into Belgium and Eastern France and then into Germany. Those are all the same battlefields of World War I. Those weren't all new, and they learned a lot of lessons. The Maginot Line and all those things. I
Yeah.
think the French learned that was a bad idea, right?
I was gonna say, did they learn a lesson of that?
Well, the Germans used it, and then the Americans and French and British had to go through it, because they reinforced it all.
Yeah.
So, once the Germans took it, it was a powerful thing for them. So,
Yeah.
but
Wow. So, Sam, I guess my last question: you've written fiction and nonfiction. How does that approach differ?
well, the funny thing is, I started out with sort of environmental thrillers because I'm a hydrogeologist. And then I kind of, morphed into kind of a little bit. I got into sort of espionage a little bit, and sort of intelligence, modern day espionage. But then I started writing basically history books, and I know they started out historical fiction, but my last 4 books were history books. They were heavily what people call heavily factual historical fiction. So I took almost no liberties with Blackbeard, with Spies of the Midnight Sun, with Lions of the Desert, with Soldiers of Freedom, except for when they're with their aide, like Patton's with his aide, his African-American driver or his aide, and he's talking to them. But it's still based on journals. So even those books are history books. Now, they are historical fiction technically because they're not footnoted or endnoted. Now I'm writing pure history books, but they're narrative style. So to be honest, my new books and my last, 5 historical fiction books, which are heavily historical and light on the fiction, are not that far off, except for that I got detailed endnotes and bibliography, which is a lot of work. You got to make sure every little thing is cited, every quote. And I have a lot more quotes. That's the big difference too. So it's not that different. It's really been, I'd have to say my last, 7 books, they're history books. They just happen to be called historical fiction. Actually, the funny thing is my publicist submitted one of my historical fiction books in a history thing to win a prize, and I won the award.
Oh, wow.
Out all the, from Bloomsbury and,
Yeah.
Diverted.
That's awesome.
And, all that. And I won actually the nonfiction award, just because it was, entered in that category.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I one day want to write like a historical fiction, like a true historical fiction. I'm so nervous because it's like it gives you too much freedom. I don't want freedom. If when you write history, you are kind of confined. You're confined by your sources, and I think I feel safe in that box. Like I'm nervous to just be like, "Boy, I could take this anywhere." Like aliens could come all of a sudden, like if I wanted to. So I'm like, no, I'm just nervous.
Though, just to give you a little tip, because of what I learned, I morphed into, I went from pure, fiction into heavily factual historical fiction into history, pure history, but narrative nonfiction style. And it was a transitional thing. So what I'm trying to say is, if you stick to the facts, the only fiction is when they're alone with their lover, because you have to have some scenes that show their warmer side, like Blackbeard. Blackbeard was in love with Margaret of Marcus Hook. He had a woman that he loved in Philadelphia because he sailed out of Philadelphia. remember, he was a privateer. He wasn't a pirate from day one. People weren't born pirates. You know, he was out of a job, and he was a Royal Navy man. You know, Blackbeard, the fearsome pirate. He never killed anybody till the day he fought at Ocracoke Island in 1718 either. Not one person. That's the amazing thing. So I think if you write, I think I would go for it, because I think if you write just heavily factual and at the end, the key that I do it is at the end, I tell everything that was accurate, you know, everything where I took any liberty at all. And people like that. They
Yeah.
seem to like at the
Yeah.
end describing, okay, everything's real, but this, and this. You know what I'm
I
saying?
love that. Yeah, like the author's historical note kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I usually make that, 15 pages long. It's not, yeah, and
Yeah.
describe what happened to the characters. And they
Yeah.
really like that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for taking the time today. This was awesome. I can't recommend the book enough. I'll make sure I put all the links to buy it in the description of this episode. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thanks a lot, Peter. It's great to talk with you.